Have you ever looked at North Korea and wondered how exactly a government manages to physically engineer total, absolute control over its own population? Well, you're in the right place. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to put on our geopolitical analyst hats and decode the physical layout of this highly secretive nation using satellite imagery. We are moving way past the standard news cycle today, and we're looking directly at the map.
Here is our agenda for today. First, the illusion of darkness, followed by tunnels and defense infrastructure, master-planned urban control, the informal market lifeline, palaces versus penal colonies, and finally, the people behind the map.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the illusion of darkness.
If you've ever seen a nighttime satellite photo of the Korean peninsula from space, the contrast is just unbelievable. South Korea is completely ablaze with light and economic activity, and North Korea? It's practically a dark void, except for a tiny little pinprick of light over the capital, Pyongyang. Now, it's really easy to look at that blackness and just assume it's completely empty. But when the sun rises, the data reveals something totally different. We're actually looking at an entire country meticulously engineered for regime preservation.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 2, tunnels and defense infrastructure.
So, the first thing that jumps out from the daytime satellite data is the sheer scale of their military. Get this, North Korea spends an astonishing 20 to 25% of its entire GDP on the military. To put that into perspective, most countries spend somewhere around 1 to 4%. Dedicating a quarter of your entire economy to defense is just mind-blowing. And all that money has to go somewhere, right? Well, it buys a staggering amount of hidden infrastructure. Down along the DMZ, there are literally 900 artillery guns aimed straight at Seoul. The mountains are practically hollowed out with secret invasion tunnels, underground bunkers, and hidden missile launch sites. But here's the really crucial takeaway. These barriers aren't just about keeping invaders out. They're built to lock the population in. We're talking about 1,400 kilometers of heavily monitored fencing right along the Chinese border, plus roughly 300 internal checkpoints that exist solely to stop citizens from moving freely between their own provinces. And speaking of unbelievable numbers, how about 100,000? That is the estimated number of highly trained bodyguards living in heavily fortified barracks with one job, protecting the Kim family. Right in the middle of Pyongyang, you can spot these hills that have been converted into giant bunkers, complete with underground escape tunnels and hidden helicopters. The whole security apparatus is designed around shielding one single family.
Let's move on to Section 3, Master-Planned Urban Control.
Now, if you want to understand a North Korean citizen's daily routine, you have to realize their living spaces are quite literally assigned to them. But before we talk about the physical buildings, we need to quickly touch on the social architecture, a system called Songben. It's a hyper-strict social caste system based entirely on your perceived political loyalty. If your family is considered loyal, you're in the core class. You might get to live in Pyongyang with its massive monuments and theme parks. But if you're labeled part of the hostile class, you get assigned to rugged rural or heavy industrial cities, where the map looks entirely different.
Okay, this is one of the most fascinating things you'll find when scanning these cities. There are over 170 newly built children's traffic parks scattered around. Why? Well, private car ownership is incredibly rare there. So kids literally aren't used to seeing vehicles on these massive, highly planned but completely empty boulevards. As a few more cars have started popping up, the government actually mandated these traffic parks just to teach kids how to not get run over, because they've never had to deal with normal city traffic. And when we look at their industrial centers, like the city of Hamhung, you really see the impact of international sanctions. Because they're cut off, they have to rely on whatever raw materials they have locally. This led to the creation of vinylon, which is basically the North Korean national fabric. Instead of cotton, it's this tough, scratchy material synthesized directly from local coal and limestone. From orbit, we can clearly see these massive vinylon factories pushing out industrial byproducts.
Which brings us to the really harsh visual reality for the working class. You don't commute from the leafy suburbs in North Korea. Satellite maps show these tightly packed, cookie-cutter assigned duplexes built immediately next door to massive steel factories, coal ports, and toxic chemical plants. Citizens are given a job, and they are forced to live right next to that harsh industrial zone for their entire lives.
But central planning only goes so far. Let's look at Section 4, the informal market lifeline.
Because the state-run economy fundamentally struggles to provide enough food and basic goods, a huge underground economy was born out of pure desperation during the horrific famines of the 1990s. By 2008, when the government tried to crack down on this unsanctioned trading, female merchants actually protested, which is incredibly rare because these markets were literally keeping their families alive. Fast forward to today, and the regime basically has to cautiously tolerate these networks.
If you look closely at the maps, you can clearly spot these large, blue-roofed market squares in almost every major town. This is where people bypass the strict central planning to trade goods that usually slip over the border from China. It's a massive, glaring visual proof that the government's total economic planning just doesn't work, and ordinary people have to take survival into their own hands.
All right, moving on to Section 5, Palaces versus Penal Colonies. This is where we see the absolute starkest, most shocking contrasts in the entire country. Looking at the data, you can physically weigh the extreme wealth gap. Over on the East Coast in Wonsan, we can see a luxurious private palace compound for the Kim family. We're talking private beaches, a shooting range, even an armored train ready to go. But then you scan over to the remote, rugged mountains and you find massive tracts of land carved out of the forest. High-security fencing, guard posts. These are the brutal political penal colonies.
And the scale of these places is just horrifying. There are roughly 700 of these penal facilities operating as forced labor camps. The craziest part? If someone is accused of wrong thinking, up to 3 generations of their family can be locked up. The largest mountain camps hold up to 50,000 inmates, including little kids doing 10 to 12 hours of brutal manual labor a day. They are literally mining the coal and chopping the wood that goes right back into building those luxury palaces for the elite.
And finally, Section 6, the people behind the map. Because honestly, it is so easy to look at the satellite data, the dark voids, the military checkpoints, the prison camps, and completely forget about the 25 million actual human beings living there. Despite the horrific struggles and the intense state surveillance, ordinary citizens still form incredibly deep community ties. Since the state restricts them from moving, neighbors live side by side their entire lives. They celebrate holidays together, they share resources, and they rely on each other. As this defector account highlights, even in a system designed for total control, you can't completely extinguish human connection.
So it leaves us with a really fascinating question. Can a government map every single inch of its citizens' lives while still fundamentally losing control to the very black markets that keep them all alive? The state builds the walls and assigns the duplexes, but it absolutely relies on unauthorized grassroots trade to stay afloat. I really hope this visual briefing expanded how you view this hidden nation, moving beyond the standard headlines to see how it actually functions on the ground. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next.